Sit down with me a while. Sit down with me a while. Sit down with me a while. Tell me the stories of the great unknown. My mouth is parched, I'm thirsty. My mouth is parched, I'm thirsty. My mouth is parched, I'm thirsty. Tell me the stories of the great unknown. Sit down with me a while. Sit down with me a while. Sit down with me a while and tell me the stories of the great unknown. Tell me the stories of the great unknown. Tell me the stories of the great unknown.
"5 a.m. in the Pine Woods" by Mary Oliver. I'd seen their hoof prints in the deep needles and knew they'd ended the long night under the pines, walking like two mute and beautiful women toward the deeper woods. So I got up in the dark and went there. They came slowly down the hill and looked at me sitting under the blue trees. Shyly they stepped closer and stared from under their thick lashes and even nibbled some damp tassels of weeds. This is not a poem about a dream, though it could be. This is a poem about the world that is ours, or could be. Finally, one of them, I swear it, would have come into my arms, but the other stamped the sharp hoof in the pine needles like the tap of sanity, and they went off together through the trees. When I awoke, I was alone. I was thinking, so this is how you swim inward. So this is how you flow outward. So this is how you pray. It's my honor and privilege to introduce two women who inspire and remind us that every moment is prayer. Lucy Duncan. I first met Lucy at a Beyond Diversity 101 workshop, which was led by Niyonu, where we were each committing ourselves to building the skills necessary to transform ourselves and to transform societal systems of separation and power over. As two white women from relatively middle-class backgrounds, we came to an even greater awareness of our own privilege and a recognition that if we want to work toward wholeness within ourselves and within the world, we would need each other's support. So we are continuing this commitment to support each other, to take courageous steps to break down barriers, and to figure out how to live in a world that is whole. Lucy's PYM write-up says, she sees a metaphor in gardens for how God might be calling Quakers as a community. We can't do it alone. We need to remember that tilling and planting the soil of transformation can only bear fruit if we do it in collaboration, that we need each other and God to grow anything nourishing. Lucy has been a professional storyteller for almost 20 years. She's been working with Quaker meetings, leading retreats, helping friends to tell stories of spiritual experience. Lucy is a member of Goshen Friends Meeting and has worked for FGC for 12 years. And she currently serves as the Friends Liaison for the American Friends Service Committee. She lives at Friends Southwest Burial Ground in the caretaker's house with her husband Graham and their son Simon. Niyonu Spann is a musician, community activist, and consultant. Her formal credentials include a master's degree in human resource management and organizational development from the American University, and a bachelor's degree in voice performance from Oberlin Conservatory of Music. And I mention these because it is Niyonu's voice, both physical and metaphorical, that is a beacon for social justice and planetary wholeness. One person noticed that after listening to Niyonu, audiences leave inspired not just to think differently, but to go out and do differently. She first became excited about Quakerism when she accompanied her former husband and then FGC Executive Director Dwight Wilson, and they visited Friends throughout the country. In 1999, she joined the staff of Friends Council on Education, and later, as a new and young adult Quaker, served for 8 years at Oakwood Friends Boarding School in Poughkeepsie, New York. Niyonu also taught at Friends Select School, which is where we met. In the early 90s, she served as the executive director for the National Green Circle program, which was created by Quaker Gladys Rollins to raise awareness with children on who they allow in their circles and who they do not allow in their circles, and ultimately increasing caring in our communities. She's a member of AFSC's National Affirmative Action Committee, former dean of Pendle Hill, and has served on the boards of FGC and Training for Change. Niyonu is a member of Chester Monthly Meeting. She feels a strong calling to work for the city of Chester, Pennsylvania, one of the poorest districts in our state. She developed a nonprofit called Four Circles Beyond and began to collaborate with Chester East Side Ministries to provide programming that fosters peaceful living through the arts and developing young leadership. This August will be the 4th year of the Peace, Leadership, and Arts Summer Camp in Chester. Niyonu is the founder of Beyond Diversity, one of the most transforming workshops I have ever experienced. She's also the co-founder of Co-Creating Effective and Inclusive Organizations, CEIO, which is a group that is helping to empower organizations to apply principles of unity and alignment to crystallize their mission, increase inclusivity, and change communities. She's blessed to have both her parents living with her now in Willingboro, New Jersey, and to watch from near and far her 4 amazing sons as writers, preachers, teachers, singers, and more spread peace and joy, each in their own ways. My deepest connection with Niyonu is in her role as director and spiritual leader of Tribe One, an ensemble of singers and performers, musicians and drummers who perform music of the spirit. We sing about justice and transformation of the soul, and our music inspires social change. Niyonu has been my friend, sister, teacher, mentor, and spirit guide for more than 25 years. I leave you with this short poem, which when I read it seemed most appropriate for these 2 amazing women and for the evening that we will have tonight. Not dawdling, not doubting, intrepid all the way, walk with clarity, with sharp eye, with sharpened sword, clear-cut the path to the translucent surprise of enlightenment. At every crossroad, be prepared to bump into wonder. Be prepared to bump into wonder.
want to give honor to the people indigenous to this land that we are blessed to be on. And invite them, those ancestors, along with all of our ancestors, to be with us tonight. Truth Heart Healing, working with spirit transforms. During this time with you, we want to explore truth, heart, and healing. I've pulled from a number of my past journal entries, speeches, songs, bringing the understanding forward in this time and in today's context. It's a joy to co-create this time with my sister and fellow traveler, Lucy. In one of our creation sessions, I said to her that I believe that the reason that we've been called to this presentation together grows purely from our lives, from our preparations in beingness. What has grown and is growing through our dance with the Holy Spirit. Give over thine own willing. Give over thine own running. Give over thine own desiring to know or to be anything. Just sink deep down to that seed that's sown so sure in our hearts. And let it grow in thee. Breathe in thee. Act in thee. And thou shalt find by sweet experience that which leads us to the inheritance of life. That which leads us to the inheritance. It is in surrendering to the dance with spirit that true transformation happens. The transformation that is all of ours to share in yearning for, to be fully human, to be love, to be truth, to be whole, to heal. I share with you tonight, pulling from some of the primary turns from my own dance with spirit. I've been led to share of my own experience thus far and how I've come to relate and relay this understanding within my Quaker family.
It's been an amazing journey since Niyonu and I were invited to do this together. For me, both scary and full of wonder as we've worked together to try to weave our stories together. And there have been these uncanny moments when we said, oh, your story is in my story, and my story is in yours. And from the beginning, I felt led to tell this story as a part of tonight. And when I told it to Niyonu, she said, yes. This is one of the stories that I've told longer than any others. And it's been a huge teacher to me. It's a sacred story in my life. Once, long ago in Scotland, there was a forest called Cowterhog Wood. In it, the trees grew taller and the grass grew greener. And in the middle of that forest was a clearing. And in the middle of that clearing was a well, and round that well grew the most beautiful roses. But not very many people had seen these roses because it was said that Cowterhog was enchanted by the fairy folk. And if you were to go there, the fairy folk would capture you and demand from you a ransom. From some, they would demand gold or silver. From others, they would take their clothes. And it was said, if you were a maid, from you they would demand your maidenhood. Well, not far from Cowterhog, there was a lord who lived in a castle with his daughter, Janet. And Janet had grown up hearing these stories, but she was brave and she cared little for those stories. And so one day she braided up her hair and she lifted up her skirts and off she went to Cowterhog. She walked and she walked until she reached that clearing. And when she reached the clearing, she saw the well. And she walked over and she looked at the roses, and they were indeed the most beautiful she had ever seen. And she picked one. And when she did, a fairy knight appeared before her, and he looked at her, and he said, why pullest thou the rose, and why pluckest thou the wand, and why comes thou to Cowterhog without my command? But Janet stood her ground. She said, my father and my father's father have all owned this land. I can come where I wish. This is my place as much as anyone's. And Tamlin looked at her and he said, oh no, my claim on this land is much older than yours. And you owe me a ransom. And he put his arms around her and he kissed her and he laid her in the grass. And she did not say him nay. Well, Janet went back to her house, and summer passed, and the fall came on, and it became clear that Janet was with child. And when her father noticed this, he said, Janet, who has done this to you? Which of the knights that sit at my table has made you pregnant? Tell me, and we will marry you to him. And Janet said, if I am with child, Father, myself I am to blame, and no man that sits around your table will give my babe his name. And as soon as she could, she braided up her hair and she lifted up her skirts, and off she went to Couterhog. She walked and she walked until she reached the clearing. She walked right to the well and she picked a rose. And when she did, Tamlin appeared before her. Janet told Tamlin that she was pregnant and that her father wanted to marry her to one of his knights. She said, "What can we do?" Tamlin looked at Janet and he said, "I was a man once, but one night I took a shortcut through Couterhog, and the fairy folk, they captured me and pulled me from my horse, and when I awoke, I was in fairyland. It is very pleasant here, but if I were a man again, I would marry you." And Janet said, "Is there no way that we can make this so?" And Tamlin said, "Yes, but it is very hard. Tonight is All Hallows Eve, and if you wait by Miles Cross and you wait there, the fairy people will come by on horses. Do you dare to do this?" "Aye," she said. Tamlin said, "Oh, but you must do more. When you see me, I will be at the head of the last group of fairy knights on white horses, and I will have one hand gloved and one hand bare. And when you see me, you must reach up and grab me from my horse and hold me and pull me down. Do you dare to do this?" "Aye," she said. "Oh, but you must do more. When you hold me and pull me from the horse, the fairy people will turn me into many strange and horrible things, but you must hold me fast and fear me not. Do you dare to do this?" "Aye," she said. "Ah, but you must do more. At the last, they will turn me into a burning branch, and when they do, you must throw me into the water there by Miles Cross, and take your cloak and wrap it around me, and then the spell will be broken. Do you dare to do this?" "Aye," she said. Janet went back to the castle, and she waited for night to fall, and people in the castle gathered around fires and closed out the dark. But Janet, she braided up her hair and she lifted up her skirts, and off she marched to Miles Cross, and she hid herself there. And the dark night, it got darker, and she waited and she waited, and she eventually heard hoofbeats on the land. And she looked out and she saw a group of fairy knights on black horses. And she let them go by. It wasn't long till she heard hoofbeats like drums on the ground again, and she looked out, and there was a group of fairy knights on brown horses, and she let them also pass. She hid herself and waited, and then she heard hoofbeats again. She looked out, and there was a group of knights on milk-white steeds, and at their head was the fairy queen, and by her side was a fairy knight with one hand gloved and one hand bare. And when she saw Tamlin, she ran to his horse and she pulled him from his horse. And when she did, there was a great outcry. The fairy folks screamed and they turned to him, and Janet held on. First, they turned him into a bear, and he was hairy and gruff. But Janet, she held on. Next, they turned him into a wolf, and he growled and he tried to bite her. But Janet held on. Next, they turned him into a hawk, and he squawked and tried to fly away. But still, Janet held on. Next, they turned him into a snake, and he hissed and wrapped around her and tried to strangle her. But Janet held on. Next, they turned him into a cold block of ice. And he was so cold that he burned her fingers, and she wanted to let go, but still she held on. And finally, they turned him into a burning branch. And when they did, she threw him into the water. And there he was, a naked man again. And Janet took her cloak and she wrapped it around him. And the spell was broken. The fairy queen came up to where Tamlin was. She leaned down and she sang, "Had I but known, Tamlin, Tamlin, a maid would ransom thee. I would have taken out thy 2 gray eyes and put in 2 eyes of tree. Had I but known, Tamlin, Tamlin, before we left from home, I would have taken out thy heart of flesh and put in a heart of stone." With that, the fairy folk turned and rode off into the night. As I've told this story and as it's taught me, I've learned a lot about it. I've learned about the power of love, but I've also understood more what Kauterhog is. It's not the fairyland of our childhood that's playful and full of sprites. It's a very dangerous place. It's the place we go when we can no longer be human. When because of trauma or hurt, we can't feel anymore, and so our heart gets hard and we have to go away. It's the place we go when we are so sensitive that we have to hide our hearts and we might seek solace in addictions. I've also come to understand it as the place we go when we breathe in racism and white privilege, when we understand ourselves as not connected to all of humanity, not connected to all of our fellow brothers and sisters. It's the place where we go when we cannot be human or we forget how to be.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all these chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say 'em loud, say 'em clear, for the whole world to hear. I resisted applying for the position of dean at Pendle Hill as long as I could. It was when I was speaking to a friend who lives in Chicago, who has known me for many, many years and who's very perceptive. I was telling my Chicago friend about being encouraged to apply. And then she replied, well, what do you think? I went into a torrent. I was like, are you crazy? I am so happy with my consulting work. I'd be nuts to go into that situation. I love my life. I just went on and on and on, and she listened. And then she simply replied, wow, why so much energy? Months later, on April 17, 2004, I stood before the Pendle Hill board and community members as the newly appointed dean and spoke these words. Bringing the fullness of who we are as individuals, I hope to be fully present. I choose to meet the boundaries challenged directly and with heart. I have lived in spiritual educational community before. I will call on the spirit of compassion for myself and for others in my new community to be fully present. When I truly rest in spirit, see, feel, act spirit-led, I recognize our interconnection. This is true on an interpersonal level and also programmatically. I intend to hold in consciousness all the ways that we live the Pendle Hill mission. Whether the manifestation is through social witness, a course in Quakerism, whatever, the guidance of spirit, meeting for worship is at the center. Then once I opened and gave it over, Spirit allowed me to see that my entire life had prepared me for this new position and for what I now understand to be a period of initiation. What I could not realize in the midst of this exciting commitment was that serving in this position with a promise to bring myself fully would require a deeper practice in discernment and more courageous truth-telling than I had yet known possible. I could not have known that my heart would be broken again and again, leading to a depth of love yet unimagined. And though many of the gifts I came to offer were misunderstood or disregarded, and at worst, dashed upon the stones, there grew a greater clarity of purpose, heart, and presence. I wish I could give all I'm longing to give. I wish I could live like I'm longing to live. I wish I could do all the things that I can't do, though I'm way overdue. I'd be starting anew. Three years after that April 17th, sharing with such excitement and commitment with the board and the Pendle Hill community. 3 years later, here I was in meeting for worship, lost in what seemed to be an insignificant mental maze. You know how it is. Sometimes you get into one of these things during worship. And this one for me was, what's the difference between letting go and giving over? Letting go and giving over. It was round and round. And I could hear Chris Ravendall's voice, who was, some of you may know, a teacher at Pendle Hill for many years, and I had taken a course with him on prayer. And I remember he said, it's not that we shouldn't have thoughts during meeting for worship, but the thought may come like a boat sailing down the river. And what you do is let the boat go by, but don't get on the boat. Well, I was definitely on the boat. What is the difference between letting go and giving over? It was also an April meeting for worship that I was sitting in this maze. It was difficult to achieve any sense of flow. In fact, I was neither in a place to give over or let go. My blood boiled with disappointment and disbelief. Had we come this far just to see it all go by reaching no destination point to justify this rugged journey? Would I again march off feeling like the only one who realized what we had passed up? I tried to resume my breathing, intending a deep inhale. My muscles locked as they bumped into something with no give, something demanding to be acknowledged. Sorrow. The seeds of sorrow were sown frequently throughout the months leading up to this Saturday in April. It was my disbelief that camouflaged the landing seeds. Were it not for my determination to disregard what was right before my eyes, the seeds might not have taken root. But then again, neither would Ken Jacobson and I have conceived this revolutionary action. I would like to invite friends, as I continue to share with you this story, to maybe acknowledge and give thanks for that part of your intellect that wants every detail. But like the boat going down the river, I invite you to let it go. For if you let it go, you will receive the whole of the story and understand deeply. Almost 2 years prior to that Saturday meeting for worship, Ken Jacobson, his wife Catherine, and I met for the first time and experienced a strong connection. They had arrived after months of a grueling search process for the interim director at Pendle Hill. Throughout the summer months, I had been one of the candidates for this same position. of interim director. The experience of being a candidate for a job that you had never applied for was weird enough. But then to turn to Spirit for guidance, only to hear the answer as, allow your name to remain in the running. When my credentials were questioned again and again, just allow your name to remain in the running. When my Quakerism was questioned, my ability to think strategically, my ability to truly grasp the organization's mission, my ability to supervise, and on, the answer I discerned in working with my care and support group remained the same. Until on the first day of the fall term that followed, I could withdraw my name. Like a machine programmed to turn on at a certain moment, on that late September day, I sat down at my computer thinking to check email and found my fingers writing a letter withdrawing my candidacy for the top position at Pendle Hill. So it was in this first meeting with Ken and Catherine in my office that we discovered that my seemingly automatic release coincided almost to the day with their out of the blue pull to consider coming to the aid of Pendle Hill to serve as interim directors. From this first conversation, we began a relationship that would continue to sparkle with synchronicity, and that would bring both a peace and a pain that passeth understanding. The events that knocked Ken and Catherine and I off of that original love trajectory seemed at the time the strangest in my life. It seemed that every time that Ken as interim director and I as dean met, there was a strange probing and questioning of my intentions. Things got crazy and quickly. Things spiraled out of control. On an aside, a couple of days ago, I heard Questlove, a very well-known hip-hop artist and member of The Roots in Philadelphia. He was being interviewed, and he was talking about his new book, and he was also talking about his feelings and response after hearing the verdict after Trayvon Martin's murder trial. And he was conveying a story about being a youngster riding in the car with a bunch of other African American males, and they were stopped by the police. And the police started screaming at them that a car had been stolen, and they fit the description. And he talked about the police officer pulling a gun and pointing it at them and saying, "Tell the truth, tell the truth." And what was most startling, partly from the wherewithal for Questlove to share this, is he said that he actually started to wonder if they had stolen a car, even though he was absolutely sure they had just driven from this church meeting during the week. He spoke of the power of being accused under the threat of your life. So Ken started pointing out small mistakes I made, an email that I hadn't responded to, questioning my character. I was accused of being a liar, found myself and my colleagues confused. I didn't get it. My job was now being threatened. It all seemed so over the top that I sought out the help to interpret what was going on. A longtime staff person became my elder whenever I needed to have a meeting with Ken. No one could explain what was going on, and I was losing my sense of self. I was losing my sense of my heart, of my grounding, what was going on here. It was during what I call the tribunal that the answer to that question would be revealed. Though I had been at this point offered and had signed a contract letter for the following year, I was informed that the offer was being reconsidered and that I was to answer specific charges in front of members of the Board of Trustees. I lost a tremendous amount of sleep as the day came closer. But during the tribunal, I would finally discover why I had been caught in what seemed to be Twilight Zone episode. Documenting the details of the tribunal here would consume unnecessary energy, but suffice it to say that ultimately, all present came to the conclusion that there was little to no substance to the accusations being lodged. And then, at that point, the words fell out of Ken's mouth. You have to realize that I started hearing complaints about you before I even arrived at Pendle Hill. I came in being told that you have a difficult dean and you are going to have to do something about her. Whether to describe this moment as time stopping or time accelerating, I don't know. What I do know is that Ken, whose true nature I had sensed from the beginning as that of honesty and love, realized in that moment the great setup that we were both suffering within. The original love trajectory that we both thought had been buried beyond recovering met a flicker of light. I gained in that moment an understanding of something spoken by my elder, Chris Ravendall. He had spoken that truth is love. In this moment, when Ken spoke the unspeakable and revealed truth, love seemed possible again. The months to follow would bring continued openings. More light. Through discussions and again trusting to be vulnerable, Ken, Catherine, and I would share our awakenings. We would step lightly again, revisiting moments from the year and a half that we had been in misrelationship. Ken would come to see and then share with me how his own racism and sense of entitlement allowed him to be persuaded and used so easily. Sometimes he would put this revelation in a form of a poem. The awakenings were for me more often confirmations, a return to firmness, a return to realness, a return to sanity, to visibility. In order to heal into my fullest, powerful self, I too needed to see my part in this. I came to recognize and appreciate my journey of allowing myself to barter with white men parts of myself, my vision, my calling in exchange for a perceived gain of credibility or power. In this pattern, I would partner with a white man in building his vision. I was valued as long as I stayed in my place and didn't bring my full vision or power to the table. I came to see how that pattern was entangled in this relationship with Ken, and even more so between his predecessor and myself, who had actually hired me as dean. I needed to speak exactly my part in helping to co-create what we were experiencing. I also came to realize how, because it had been a woman of color involved in some of the first issues, I refused to acknowledge and respond to the early signs. I bought into the survival pattern that we need to never call each other out. I came to see that in the long run, the lack of honesty between us, the lack of calling each other out, created the very dysfunction and pain that we had desperately hoped to avoid. With Ken, and sometimes along with Catherine, we began to have some of the most honest conversations of our lives. In order to fall more and more deeply in love, we had to continually confront misconceptions, misarticulations, fear, and any signs of addiction to illusion. Addiction to the illusion of our identity that we held on to so tightly. Recently, this is back to now, recently in response to Trayvon Martin's murder and the verdict after the trial, Mumia Abu-Jamal in his radio broadcast said the following: attention to the episodic elicits tears. Say that again. Attention to the episodic elicits tears, while contemplation on the systematic brings the challenge of change. So Ken, Catherine, and I were doing this important work of increasing our awareness, rebuilding trust, and strengthening our hearts. There needed now to be action on the systems level. Walking as best as we could with Spirit's guidance, that action followed this way. I had to write a letter to the Pendle Hill Board bringing the light of systemic discrimination of which I had been a target. I had to send this letter to the clerk of the board asking that she distribute it to the general board. After she refused, Ken had to support the letter and actually let trustees know that he felt used and set up to work against me. I had to file a case against Pendle Hill with the EEOC. I then had to come to know that filing the case was not the way to bring this discrimination to light. That was not the way of transformation to which I was being called. much to the dismay of my lawyer. Ken and Catherine had to come to see how many other ways that there was discrimination against African Americans and this African American dean throughout other parts of Pendle Hill as a system. I had to withdraw my EEOC case and instead send my letter to the entire board. This, for me, was the most terrifying act that I've shared yet, because it confronted a core part of my identity to which I cling: being a good girl. This felt like the actions of a bad girl and an unprofessional person. We all had to sit in the fire that was generated by the over 50 board members living now with this information. And in the midst of all this, Ken and Catherine began to encourage me to apply for the position of permanent executive director. We Quakers often say, my name had not occurred to me. I was most grateful to have no inclination nor leading to walk down that path.
After I heard the George Zimmerman verdict, it took me a few days to cry. I read a lot of things that were posted on social media, and I went to the rally at Love Park and felt the despair and the frustration and the holy rage that was there. But I didn't cry. I've been taught for so long who it's okay to grieve for and who it's not okay to grieve for. I have to admit that after Sandy Hook, I cried. I cried for the white children that died in that massacre. But for days, I couldn't cry. And then I rode my bike, and I thought about what it would be like if Simon, my 11-year-old son, every time he left the house, was perceived to be a threat. If when he walked home from school, people crossed the street. If when he was in a grocery store, he got followed. And then I cried. And I cried because I can listen. I can try to understand. But the day-to-day reality of living with that kind of pain, I can never know. That, my friends, is white privilege. How did I learn this? How did I learn to be disconnected from so many? I was born in Iowa, and I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, a very segregated city. And most of the time, I was in the company of white people. I just assumed it was normal to live a segregated life. And when I encountered people of color, my family didn't teach me to reach out and try to connect and I breathed in the assumption that I was better than so many people. My mom was working on affirmative action at the Children's Theater where she was a director, and she was the manager of an African American dance company, but she didn't talk with me about racism. So the silent curriculum of white privilege is what I breathed in and what I learned against my will, without my consent. I didn't know I was learning it, but I was being taught to disconnect from the pain and joy and experience of so many. Sometimes there were more explicit lessons. When I was 5 years old, we went to visit my grandmother. She lived in a big white house on Peachtree Boulevard in Atlanta. The house was full of rooms, rooms upon rooms. And she told me not to interact with her African American housekeeper. She made it clear that we were not to go into the kitchen. And I feel sadness that I didn't resist this lesson and question it. I did what she said. I was a good girl. But the irony is that she didn't interact with me much either. She spent all her time in the den, watching TV and drinking beer.
Who could have predicted this? What transpired during that final week leading up to the big board meeting was the stuff of dreams. It's still difficult for me to hold the events in the realm of reality. Emails were flying, strange requests were being made. There was confusion about what anybody could say about anything in front of anyone else. Bizarre beyond belief, and then it happened. Jean Eden, the new general board clerk, asked to sit with Ken and I to discuss the coming weekend. The former general board clerk had resigned the week before, effective immediately. I forget when Jean sat us down just who began speaking first, but a picture unfolded before us. There was an electric knowing that increased as each of us spoke. We were often completing each other's thought. We knew what we had to do. By the time we finished, a most powerful and healing possibility lay before us. Once spoken, it sent a jolt of love through the three of us at once. A frightening thought. We had to be justice in real time. Ken and I would dialogue our story in front of the entire community. Board members, trustees, students, staff, all who would show up on that Saturday night. This was it. Members of the Racial Justice Committee, my support committee, friends, anyone who knew any of the painful and wonderful living of the past 2 years were instantly excited by the idea. We continue to hold the planning and preparation with the delicate humility that comes when you finally begin to feel the labor pains. The time has come. And though Ken had been instructed not to have this dialogue with me, we sat in open dialogue in front of all parts of that community, trusting the way of truth. We couldn't tell the whole story, but any expressions of truth in those moments was the whole truth. The most important part was our sharing of how each of us participated in perpetuating systemic patterns and how we learned what love could do. And following our sharing, the floor was open, inviting others to own parts in co-creating such pain, oppression, injustice, and healing. There were so many rules broken in the midst of this journey. And I feel even in the leading to share this with you this evening, I heard the voices within me that say, it's not appropriate. But so many stories and so much of our truth is locked in inappropriate stories to share. So people began to rise after Ken and I had sat in the center of the circle. Staff members, students, all except for members of the one body that felt that this was really wrong to do. But the stories were shared. And I could feel the ancestors breathing along with us as they are now and whispering, give over, give over, remember, and be free.
In 1992, I was a teacher in Vallejo, California. You may remember that was when the Rodney King verdict happened and the riots that followed the announcement of that verdict too. The next morning, when I went to my classroom, I interrupted our normal schedule and I had my students sit in a circle with me on the rug. My class was minority white, There were 14 different cultures in that room, and most of them were African American. And I talked about what had happened. I talked about the car chase and the way that the police had beaten up Rodney King, and that it had been captured on videotape. But even so, the police were not convicted. And I said that people are so upset and angry that they're rioting, they're breaking things. And my students, one by one, they told me their stories of experiencing racism. My sweet 7-year-old students, about being heckled while they walked down the street, about being followed when they went into a store, about their brothers and sisters being stopped by police all the time. I asked them what they thought would make it better. And they said, we're really different from each other here. Us being friends and staying friends, that could help. I said, yes, that could help. And I said, out of my ignorance, I said, I don't think the riots will. I don't think violence will. And then we got up off the rug and we returned to our day. And Francis, this sweet son of African immigrant children, parents, came to me weeping. And he said, Miss Duncan, my dad thinks the riots are a good thing. And I said, Francis, maybe he believes if things get bad enough, then they'll change. And later, I understood what Martin Luther King said, that riots are the voice of the unheard, the language of the unheard. My students taught me about racism, and other people who thought that their time wouldn't be wasted taught me about racism. But still, I wasn't apprehending it fully. People would go to anti-racism trainings, and I didn't know what that had to do with me. There was a whole level I didn't understand. And then I was at a Beyond Diversity training with Niyonu several years ago. And we had just finished dancing to free up our understanding. And I had been hearing story after story from the people of color in the workshop about the daily impacts of racism in their lives. And I sat there, and something broke open in me. And I understood how I had been taught, schooled in disconnection for so long, and how I was connected to generations of being taught racism and disconnection. I thought of that moment with my grandmother in her house. I remembered that she subscribed to a parenting philosophy that said you do not touch your children. I thought of my father, who was a closeted gay man, married to my mother for 33 years and could not say who he was. And I remembered a scene from the movie Night, John, where the slaveholder is teaching his son to whip those he has enslaved. And I understood that that kind of hardness was in my family too. I understood then that the racism and disconnection that we're taught it doesn't just have perpetual, daily, horrible impacts on people of color. It impacts us in white families too. It makes us disconnect from one another and not be human with one another. I realized that there is also a sublimated anxiety in the white community, a pushed down awareness that our comfort is built on the suffering of others. That moment changed me. The numbness, the curriculum, the cocoon of white privilege is persistent, and it's hard to stay awake. Since that moment, I make mistakes all the time. I operate out of my white privilege and my internalized sense of dominance. But I understand that my humanity and that of Simon is connected to the humanity of all. That until all of us are free, none of us is free. And that leads me to try to live with an open heart, to have a soft and receptive heart so that I can hear the stories of injustice from my friends of color without defensiveness, with a thick skin. I'm clumsy about it, but I talk with Simon about race and racism. I was in a healing and rebuilding our communities workshop not long ago. And there was a trauma nurse that was in that workshop, and she said that when somebody comes in with a traumatic wound, you can't put a bandage on it. You have to abrade it and expose it to the light before it can heal. And if you don't, if you just put a bandage on it, it will fester, and that person might lose a limb, or it could kill them. Friends, we are living with generational trauma in our midst, and we are not healing from it. We need to go and reach to understand the depth of the trouble that we're in and have it be revealed. We need to go through the pain of recognizing, remembering, so that we can be a whole community. Can we hold one another as friends, as U.S. citizens, as these hard stories are told, as the demons within us are revealed and emerge? Can we hold each other with love and without fear so that we can heal? Can we hold each other as Janet held Tamlin? Can we be like Tamlin and release the wounds and the horrors that lie within us?